Awesome. So first I want to bring you the land acknowledgement from the Milton Public Library. Milton Public Library operates on treaty lands and the traditional territory of Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, and Haudenosaunee peoples. As we center truth and support reconciliation across Milton, our commitment to provide highest quality service for all is inspired by First Peoples' traditional knowledge, laws, and philosophies. Laurier and its campuses are located on the Haldimand Tract, the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. It is a gathering place that is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. At Laurier, we recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which Laurier is present. I encourage you to take time to reflect on the history of the land that you are on when you attend this event, as you reflect on today's topic when you go into your life doctor tonight. I want to thank you for joining us this evening and welcome you to the Laurier Milton Public Library Lecture Series. This is our second last lecture for the year. And tonight's topic is understanding race-based data. We have three experts with us to have a discussion tonight, and I would like to begin by introducing them to you. So on my right, your right, my left, we have Dr. Patrick Watson, who is an adjunct professor at Wilfrid Laurier University in the Department of Criminology. He received his PhD in sociology from the University of Manchester in the UK in 2010, and then held a postdoc at Waterloo from 2011 to 13 in the Sociology and Legal Studies Department. He is the principal investigator of the SHIRP Partnership Development Grant entitled Charting the Reasonable Officer, and this project studies the use of force decisions made by the Ontario Special Investigations Unit. He is also the first Canadian scholar to successfully lead an application to the Open Research Area Grant. That is a grant competition, and his project analyzes policing and civilian police oversight across Canada, the UK, Germany, and France, with academic partners based in all of those 4 countries. So he brings international experience to the talk tonight. He will be also joined tonight by a member of the Scene Justice Research Team, Lakhdeep Singh, who is a PhD candidate in the Sociology and Legal Studies Department at the University of Waterloo. His research broadly focuses on the intersections between race and policing. His dissertation research examines the qualitative experiences of individuals who have come in contact with police tactical units. His research is funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. Thank you for congratulations on holding that scholarship. And welcome tonight. The discussion will be led by Lakhdeep Singh Dhaliwal, who is the Chief Diversity Officer at Milton Public Library. He is the first person to hold that position. He brings to the position a passion and purpose for frontline leadership in the field of anti-racism, human rights, equity, and inclusion. He has worked with school boards across North America during new teacher induction programs in both the public and private setting, and has assisted global corporations such as Shell Petroleum Global Solutions, YMCA Canada, Crown Indigenous Relations Northern Affairs Canada, Halton Women's Place, the Oregon Institute of Technology and Parks Canada, to promote dignity and respect for all. His work involves helping turn employee research groups into champions of justice. Following the presentation tonight, he is also a Laurier alumnus. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. We have a Laurier powerhouse with us tonight. Following the presentation from our speakers, we invite the audience to ask questions. Please be respectful and limit your one question so we can make it through the queue and we can wrap it up by 8 o'clock tonight. I also want to mention that we understand that some of what might be discussed tonight may be emotionally distressing and overwhelming to folks. If you require support following this event, there are a number of service providers who may be able to provide you with additional support and ongoing support. There are resources posted on the entry to this space on the door when you walked in, and there are also copies of this information available at the box office, so please get the help if you need it. I would also invite you to take this opportunity before we begin to set your phones to silent. Thank you so much for joining us. Patrick and Lakhdeep and Tandy, we appreciate your time to speak with us this evening. And I will first turn it over to Patrick to give some comments about the introduction to race-based data.
Thank you very much, Shauna. Thank you, everyone, for making it out tonight. I think I just had a few quick comments that I really wanted to make to kick things off. I don't want to sound overly grandiose. I'd really like to avoid that at all costs. But at the same time, I take this research agenda quite personally in the sense that I think this is one of the two pressing or defining research areas of our time, along with climate change, and that racial equity and climate change are also intimately intertwined. And so I do appreciate everyone taking the time to come and hear our remarks and maybe learn from some of our experience and also help teach us a little bit more about where we can go with this research. I wanted to talk just very briefly about where race-based data collection comes from. And it's a practice that's existed for nearly 60 years now. Back in the 1960s, this was pioneered by somebody called Kwame Ture, who was interested in infant mortality rates in Georgia, the United States, and was particularly concerned with the higher proportion of infant mortality among black babies within the first year of birth. And what he was able to do with his race-based data collection analysis was to determine that there were no medical factors associated with the higher rates of infant mortality in Georgia. It was entirely decisions made by the society about resource distribution. That black babies were dying more frequently because of the disproportionate access to grocery stores, the disproportionate access to electricity and clean drinking water, clean housing, safe housing, these types of facilities that are so important and that so many people who are in my position have always taken for granted as being accessible to everybody. That obviously the early part of my life has been entirely ignorant to this, and my learning process continues down that front. Canada historically has been a laggard when it comes to race-based data analysis and collection, even compared to the United States. In the United States, race-based data is collected much more frequently. Race is identified on a driver's license, for example. So it's much easier in the United States to track things like an officer's stop statistics and figure out when it is that elements of racial profiling are showing up in things like police data, in things like hospital data and other places. So what's happened in Canada, and especially in Ontario, over the last 5-6 years is there's been a sea shift in understanding what it is that we need to accomplish in terms of understanding racial disproportionality and disadvantage caused by societal distributions of resources that impact racialized communities more deeply than it impacts the white majority. Race-based data collection in Ontario was implemented through the Anti-Racism Act of 2017. But I think it's important to talk about the precursors to that act. In 2015, in July of 2015, a gentleman named Andrew Loku, who lived in Toronto, was in a neighborhood dispute in an apartment building. And Toronto police were called to respond to that dispute. When they arrived at that apartment building, they found Andrew Loku in a hallway bearing a hammer. 2 police officers were down the end of that hallway. Andrew Loku progressed towards those officers. He raised the hammer above his head. He was instructed to drop the hammer, and he didn't, and those police officers shot Andrew Loku to death in response to that action. Now, that death was investigated, as is every death at the hands of an Ontario police officer, by the Special Investigations Unit, the province's police watchdog. And in the following year, in 2016, in March of 2016, the SIU released what's called its director's decision, where they concluded that those officers acted within the bounds of the law, that they lawfully shot and killed Andrew Loku. And in response to that, protesters with Black Lives Matter, in particular, as well as other community groups, occupied Toronto Police Headquarters, and they demanded that the province begin collecting race-based data so that we could start to understand disproportionality in relation to police violence, but also in relation to the other services that are administered by the province of Ontario public service organizations. So in 2017, that legislation was passed into effect, and it was put into power in 2020 when the race-based data collection methodology was established by the province of Ontario. So now every provincial organization has to collect, every public service organization in the province of Ontario has to collect and analyze race-based data and develop strategies for addressing disproportionality of racialized groups in those data. So the province identified 4 specific areas in the Race-Based Data Act itself. The first of those was policing services, and the second was bail reform, or bail services. And as criminologists, as Tandeep and I are, this of course puts us right in the middle of this. They also talk about, mention in the legislation, health services and education. So Tandeep and I have experience doing race-based data analysis in the field of policing. We have both conducted these analyses as well as reviewed the analyses of other police services. We've conducted the analyses for the Special Investigations Unit itself, and I sort of take that as being a unique privilege and honor in as much as this is where it all started. So it's really been an eye-opening experience and a rewarding experience to start trudging through the data they've collected and trying to understand the disproportionality figures that they have represented in their data. That report will be coming out soon. We can't talk about any of the details of that report until it is released. But those of you who are interested in reviewing this talk later, please do feel free to reach out to us. And the report will be publicly available both on the SIU's website and ours. And we'll be able to ask, respond to any questions that evolve from that. But tonight we're going to talk more generally about race-based data collection and the sorts of conclusions that we might draw from things like the Disproportionality Index that is mandated within the Data Standards Collection Act.
A couple of questions that come through discussions and through some of the research that you pointed us towards. Thank you, Dr. And referring to Tandeep's also experience in this regard. Here's one that comes through, and one that's highlighted in some of our discussions, even leading up to today. Given that the service providers can set their own baseline populations, what steps does the ARD or the Anti-Racism Directorate take to ensure compliance with the objectives of the ARA or the Anti-Racism Act?
So Tandeep can probably explain the first part of that question. Tandeep does the statistical analysis for our project on how the numbers unfold. So maybe you want to handle the first part on the baseline data.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for providing us the opportunity to attend tonight and to deliver our work and be a part of this talk. As it relates to the question about baselines and baseline data, what is important to consider is the fact that these population statistics, or these statistics that we calculate or we use to consider disproportionality, public service organizations have the ability to establish their own baseline population. So what we mean by this is, in a hypothetical example, let's assume that we had 2 daycares. We had 100 students in total. In one daycare, there were only 10 students, and in the other daycare, there were 90 students. 5 students in the smaller daycare are able to play piano, and 5 students in the larger daycare play piano. On the surface, it appears that these numbers are equal, that 5 students in one and 5 students in the other can play the piano. However, we have to consider the broader context of the data and in particular examine where that data comes from a baseline population. So one of the issues that frequently comes up in the context of race-based analysis is the fact that public service organizations have the ability to establish their own baseline proportion. We, as researchers, are really drawing the conclusion that the most appropriate way of doing this is by comparing each program outcome to the proportion of one racial group's relative composition in the population. What this means is that if in a hypothetical scenario we see that 15% of use of force incidents involve black people, this 15% figure should then be compared in contrast to the fact that black people may only account for less than 5% of the population. It is a flawed assumption to view each of these racial groups as being equally representative of the population. Furthermore, it's also a flawed assumption to conduct these analysis without the use of population statistics, because it implies that each of these groups experiences a social role equally, and that the service provider does not have a role in, or does not have any impact in contributing to the way the service user interacts with the institution. So it's for that reason that there needs to be a greater level of consistency with respect to how disproportionality is calculated, and the Anti-Racism Act establishes the need for a baseline population or a baseline proportion. However, the issue and the challenge that we are starting to see more and more, particularly as it relates to certain police services, is the fact that the baseline population is no longer being compared to one racial group or one ethnic group's relative proportion of the population.
In terms of enforcing change with relation to the findings of these reports, Tandeep raises such an important issue here that what we're looking at is there are good reasons for public service organizations to be able to set their baseline measures. It wouldn't make sense to do analyses of, for example, seniors care facilities and consider the entire Ontario population, or to take Tandeep's example, child care services and compare the Ontario population. You want to narrow down your service user band to the appropriate service users, so people within certain age brackets for both of those different groups. So you wouldn't want to compare them to the entire Ontario population. But when it comes to sort of, once you determine what your relevant population is and deciding what sorts of change there has to be, there seems to be an interrogative process where the service organizations themselves will go to, I believe it's a relatively new ministry, the Anti-Racism Directorate, where they'll start to have a conversation. Each of these organizations is also supposed to be forming a stakeholder group. They are meant to be doing community engagement, and they are meant to be doing forms of qualitative as well as quantitative analyses to augment these data so that we can start to understand not just the disproportionality figures. In a lot of these cases, take the SIU for example, if you're downstream from policing, you're going to expect to see disproportionality figures that reflect the disproportionality of policing. If the SIU is investigating use of force cases, and use of force in the province of Ontario is disproportionately affected upon people of color, upon black people and Indigenous people, as we know from Toronto Police's use of force reporting and their race-based data analysis, from Waterloo Regional's data analysis repeals, and so forth and so on down the list, then we're going to expect to see disproportionality at the SIU as well, or at other services that are downstream from policing. Now the question is, what types, if any, discrimination will there be at these other services where they are downstream of the source, as it were, of the discrimination in the first instance? So that's a conversation that's going to have to evolve, and if you ask somebody like me, it's a conversation that needs to be had in public as well. That this is the type of activity that demands strong public engagement and public feedback so that we can start to understand the impact these services are having on people of color and that are creating these disproportionate outcomes, and what the effect of those disproportionate outcomes are on people of color. That unless we start asking those types of questions to people who are experiencing these conditions, we won't know how to respond to them. And I think the impression that I'm getting from the Anti-Racism Directorate is they are active on this. They are aware that these types of things need to be done at both a quantitative and qualitative level, but it's going to be a matter of figuring out how to appropriately reach these service users and figure out how to put their suggestions into action to make sure that we're reaching and achieving the outcomes that are desired here, racial equity and justice.
I think just to add on to one of the points that Dr. Watson made, is the idea that the use of quantitative statistics allows us to demonstrate whether there is an issue or whether there is not an issue. With that being said, if we were to assume that, for example, use of force statistics were proportionate between one racial group in terms of what they experience and the relative proportion of the population, that doesn't mean that racism, that doesn't mean that these forms of discrimination do not affect the interaction. Just because there's proportionality or just because there's disproportionality, it does not mean that race did not play a role in the interaction. And that's why it's essential to engage in the qualitative research. That's why it's essential to develop an understanding of how people, of how individuals, whether they're service providers or whether they're service users, view race in the context of decision making. And more particularly, what we want to assess is how individuals feel that a race contributed towards their interaction or contributed towards their outcome, and then understanding how these individuals each process the experience of racism or the experience of discrimination. And I think that's one of those things that's very central to understanding the way racism operates, because just by quantitatively measuring racism, we're missing out on such a rich understanding of how racism operates. And in particular, one of the things that we want to ensure we're doing, especially in our research, is we want to make sure that we have a better opportunity to provide individuals with a platform to share their lived experiences, because those lived experiences cannot be captured in a survey. Those lived experiences cannot be quantified simply in a data set of zeros and ones. Those lived experiences are largely those that have to be articulated in the context of research for us to develop a better and stronger understanding of how racism operates throughout these institutions and how racism potentially influences service user outcomes as it relates to their interactions with public service organizations.
You can't manage what you can't measure. But in this regard as well, as Tandy reminds us, that even if you measure it, it doesn't mean you get it, or live it, or feel it. You invoked the name Andrew Loku tonight, and many of us freeze in that moment, that hallway as you described, that state of distress that this young man, beautiful man, and in my family we don't say black, we say beautiful black. It's such a counter to the narrative that we presented with here in North America, especially all black people are black people. They ain't black people, they're beautiful black people. Beautiful black people. That to the point I've seen my nieces now, when they speak on this topic or any topic related to beautiful black bodies, they will naturally slide it into the conversation. Oh, lucky mama, last week this beautiful black teacher was at my school. And I'm thinking, what does that mean to this young mind who's saying it, but also the young mind who's feeling it, living it, seeing it around them, you know? The power of language. Let's shift our power of language to some positiveness coming out of this data set as well. Another discussion point was, do you have any examples of how race-based data findings are being used to improve specific outcomes and service outcomes for specific communities?
Well, the first thing I would say is that this is an incredibly new process. So we saw the first sets of race-based data being released last summer. We're coming out a year now, of Toronto Police releasing their first ever race-based data report. They did make a number of recommendations in that report. The degree to which those have been implemented should be revisited as their next report comes out next year, this summer. So we're probably months away from hearing what sort of concrete steps Toronto Police have started to make. And of course that was a very, very highly engaged with report in the media. The other police services across the province of Ontario have also been releasing their reports, not quite to the same degree of public attention, but nevertheless they're there, and they all come with their sets of recommendations. We tend to see a list of maybe what criminologists would refer to as familiar recommendations. We see things like sensitivity training and cultural sensitivity training being sort of instructed. And not to sound overly cynical, but I think because criminologists have spent a great deal of time looking at these types of reports and hearing the types of good faith suggestions that have been put forward, but seeing that police shootings continue to increase every year in this country, and that racialized people continue to experience violence at the hands of the police in this country at highly disproportionate levels. According to Toronto Police's data, 2.2 times the proportionality of the population relative to white people in the city of Toronto. That we really need to, in my opinion, again, turn to the public, and this is a vital aspect of policing in a democratic country, is that policing gains its legitimacy from the consent of the policed. And I think we forget that too often, that we hear the police tell us, well, this is how we do our job. I don't want to take anything away from the notion of professionalism in policing. I think it's important that police act in a professional manner. But ultimately, who decides what is a professional manner for the police is the public, not the police themselves. And if we don't have public engagement with these data exercises, if we don't have the public coming out and saying, we're not good with this anymore, we need you to listen when you are told what these exercises are. We need you to act on them. We need you to change and to recognize beautiful black bodies as being legitimate, as being entitled to rights and respect and a presence like every other member of our society. We will not see the change. We need to make sure that we raise our voices in solidarity with our brothers and sisters, and that we say they must be recognized. Their citizenship, their humanity, their beauty must be recognized. We can mention Andrew Loka, we can mention Regis Kraczynski-Paquette, somebody who lived in my neighborhood and whose building I ride my bicycle past relatively frequently. And I've read that report so many times now and have come to so many different conclusions about what happened in those chaotic moments. And I just can't help but be distressed that we even ended up in that circumstance in the first place, that something wasn't done earlier, that something wasn't figured out earlier. And when I talk to police officers, they tell me, this is frontline police officers, they tell me, you know what, take a little bit of our budget and put it towards mental health services, and if we never have to go to another mental health call, that's money well spent. It's not that far beyond the imagination to think that there are other ways to do this, there are other ways to organize the society, where we can see that these recommendations are put into force, and maybe they're not even needed in the first place. Maybe we can get to an area where we don't have to think about how an officer is assessing a situation based on the racialized characteristics of the people they're interacting with. Maybe they just don't need to be there in the first place as being looked after by somebody who has a different skill set, who has more familiarity with the types of exigent circumstances that are going on, and who has more capability to address those circumstances.
I think one of the key things to remember is the relative newness to which race-based data is being used, particularly as it relates to the field of policing. As Dr. Watson mentioned, services like the Regional Police, the Waterloo Regional Police Service, the Toronto Police Service, and many others in the province have recently, within the last 2 years, started releasing their race-based analysis and have started offering recommendations for how to address the racial disproportionality observed in things like presence and intelligence reports, and things like use of force decisions, and things like strip searches, and a range of different policing practices. It is not enough to say, well, we engage in race-based data, and now we know what it tells us. This problem is very deep. This problem is something that runs very deep into the core of Canadian society, and it's something that has its roots in colonialism, it has its roots in racism, it has its roots in the very structure of white supremacy operating throughout society. So what we want to assess and what we want to consider is the idea that we can continue engaging in race-based data. We can continue engaging in these analyses, and these analyses can continue to show us that this racial disproportionality exists. With that being said, like Dr. Watson mentioned, we have to interrogate these recommendations and see how frequently are they being employed, how frequently are they being measured, how frequently are they being followed in the manner that they're supposed to be employed, and what outcome are these recommendations having. Because just to say that we are going to recommend additional training, not to sound cynical, but we've heard that many times. As a racialized person, reading that, to me it's something that I've heard it over and over and over again. Okay, like let's get past the training part and let's actually make some change here. This is not an issue that we're going to see resolved in a year. This is not an issue that we're going to see resolved in 2 years. The problem runs far deeper than many public service organizations recognize or are willing to admit. That's why the race-based data is important. In the context of my research on police use of force, the statistics will demonstrate that the most violent forms of police encounters, particularly as it relates to the use of SWAT teams, or what most people refer to as SWAT teams, that these disproportionately affect the Black and Indigenous community. Dr. Scott Wortley from the University of Toronto can engage in this research. Dr. Eric Laming from Trent University can engage in this research. Dr. Kanika Samuels-Wortley from Toronto Metropolitan University can engage in this research, which demonstrates that racial disproportionality exists, which demonstrates that racial disparity exists. It's not a case of not knowing that this exists. It's a case of we know this exists, we know this is an issue. What steps are being taken to address these issues to ensure that race does not have that same degree of influence on individuals' interactions with the system? And this is where the need for qualitative research comes into play. The numbers on their own are not enough. We need to understand the lived experiences of people who come in contact with these institutions to better understand how race influences their interactions and their outcomes within whatever service provision that we assess.
Thank you. It's not an accusation, it's an observation of what's happening around us. And now that observation demands a response, less of a reaction and more of a response. Thank you. You know, another key question in some of our lead up to tonight was around, you know, what questions should we be asking? So let's go down this path for a moment. What kinds of questions should we be asking racialized service users about their experience during focus groups or perhaps interviews?
One of the most unique and one of the most interesting questions that I've ever heard asked in an interview, and it's something that we frequently use in our interviews. It's not a very complex question on the surface, but it has much deeper meaning when we break these questions or these responses down to things. The question that is often asked in our meetings or in our interviews with participants is, what impact do you think your race had on the decision? Or how do you think your race played into this interaction? That in and of itself provides us data that no survey will ever be able to truly capture. It provides us with an opportunity to understand how individuals live, perceive, and experience their race, how they believe others perceive their race. It's something that, as simple of a question as it may be, the detail and the richness and the depth of the response that we receive allows us to understand how people experience life in their skin, how people experience life in their interactions with certain public service organizations. One of the most important components of that question is the fact that we're moving away from an academic understanding of racism. We want to provide individuals the opportunity to identify what racism means to them. Right? It's not enough for a bunch of researchers to be in the ivory tower and saying, well, this is what racism looks like. It's far more important to provide that avenue, provide that voice to those who are most affected by this issue and allow them to contextualize their lived experience in their own words. And this again highlights the need for much deeper qualitative approaches on this issue.
This, I think, is such an important question. I think it's something that we need to hear from our research respondents. One of the things that we always conclude our interviews with is we ask, was there anything that we should have asked you today that we didn't? And generally speaking, we don't get very much by way of addendums, things that were added in. So I can sort of take some pleasure in that. But I think, you know, one of the things that we really need to focus on is whether it's like our research in policing and civilian police oversight, or whether it's in research in healthcare, or whether it's research in education. What we're talking about is a power imbalance between the service provider and the service user. That's especially pronounced in policing, but it's pronounced in medicine and care provision, where you're talking about care providers having power over the patients they serve. And of course, you know, there's all kinds of sociological and criminological discussions of how power is exercised through different means and so forth. So it's not as if we're saying one group is powerless and the other group is powerful. I want to be quite clear about that. But that there is an imbalance in power. And this is recognized in law. That when we go to adjudicate these circumstances, we talk about literally, in the case of policing, a reasonable police officer as a legal fiction or a legal construct. And that the police officer's action in a use of force, in a decision to investigate, to use invasive investigative techniques, or whatever other interactions they have with the public, is framed when it comes before the courts or when it comes before civilian oversight agencies as a question of reasonableness. Would this fictional, reasonable officer have acted in the same way of this officer who stands accused? And I always think the most important question we ask our research respondents, and we interview both police officers who have been investigated by the SIU and what are called affected persons, people who have been victimized by police violence. And we always ask them, for you, why was this interaction reasonable or unreasonable? And I don't want to lay in on either side. I want to hear the stories come out, and I want to hear the invocation. And then I want to put that out into the world and say, we are all reasonable people. Let us hear these stories and hear what these versions of reasonableness are, and say, as a community, as a group together, what do we find in these stories that needs to be propagated and built upon, and what do we need to find in these stories that needs to be addressed and corrected and understood differently. So that's my favorite question that we ask our respondents, and this of course goes through the other care provisions, the other types of service providers as well, that in medical malpractice law, you have the reasonable physician. One of the really interesting elements is there, a researcher at the University of Toronto named Patrick Guéron, and he's got a hyphenated last name. Can't remember the second part of his hyphenated last name, but he was presenting in a session with us last year, talking about the reasonable doctor as we were talking about the reasonable police officer. And his presentation talked about how specialists could be compared to specialists, and generalists, GPs, could be compared to generalists. But if you were in a court of law and you wanted to have an expert witness as a medical practitioner come in and provide opinion evidence against an accused malpractice doctor, you couldn't bring in a specialist to comment on the capabilities of a generalist. You needed to have a generalist come in. And these are such interesting questions. And when it comes to policing, again, because policing is a democratic institution, one of the things that I really hope comes out of my research is a broader understanding of the idea of professionalism in policing, and it's tied to public understandings of what counts as professional, any professional conduct. So getting those stories of reasonableness and professionalism down, to collect them, to share them, and to learn from them, to me is so important. That's the question that really invigorates me every day, is why was this interaction reasonable or unreasonable? And tell us how. Tell us how it was experienced that produced the reasonableness or unreasonableness of this circumstance.
Not just in those fields, in the field of education, look who's being suspended at higher rates than any other student in that school. Look at who gets expelled. Look at who doesn't even get to even say anything before they're asked to leave the class. And you will start to see this truth permeate through all kinds of systems in our society. Thank you for that. Tandy, would you like to add to that? Let's shift. I knew it. I knew it.
Sorry, I can't.
Please.
I think one of the unique conversations that we've had over the course of the last few weeks as we further engage with our research is in the context of reasonableness, how these decisions are made, more so outside of the legal realm. The idea of the social location of the people involved, and in particular to understand how would a middle-class white person have interacted in this particular scenario. And if the person does not, and the person not the subject of the interaction does not adhere to that archetype, then they are perceived as being unreasonable. And I think that's one of the really unique things that we've had here, in the sense that it is, in essence, another form of othering. Right? It is a form of essentially using a predetermined social location, privileging that social location and that worldview ahead of others, and using that to justify or otherwise explain the actions of either individuals in contact with the police or the decision-making of police officers and so on. So I think it's very important that, as Dr. Watson mentioned, there needs to be a far decision-making processes of actors, but also how this construct of reasonableness is used to understand what is viewed as quote-unquote acceptable behavior within the realm of a specific institution or within the realm of a specific interaction. And I think that's, again, these are findings and these are contributions that we're able to derive from the qualitative portion of our research. Right? This isn't something that we'll be able to identify in a survey or identify using a statistical analysis. These are contributions and findings that we're able to identify ourselves as largely due to the fact that we're able to develop better understanding of how people experience these interactions, and more particularly how people identify with these labels or the mechanisms they use to combat or compete with the labeling of themselves as either being unreasonable or reasonable.
Thank you. You know, we want to just move towards a really important part, especially in my family, this is an important part. Well, let's just jump into it. Participation in that rights-based data, totally voluntary, not expected. How does the ARD or the Anti-Racism Directorate account for this?
I think this is a really fascinating part of the data that we're able to gather. And credit has to go to the service providers for gathering the data. That it's usually a frontline service worker who is administering a survey. The survey takes on a fairly basic form. There's 7 racial categories that are identified by the province of Ontario, plus 8 or 9 religious ethnic categories that are identified. And these are put into a paper form, and it's entirely voluntary for service users, whether or not they want to give their personal information to the service provider. Of course, people are taking a risk when they do this. It can be seen by any public sector organization, service provider, as being a form of threat, that they're arguably being stigmatized and intimidated and these types of things. So I'm really interested in what motivates the individual to participate in the race-based data collection exercise in the first instance. Now, our research is in the area of civilian police oversight, so we're generally talking about people who've experienced violence at the hands of police. And you can imagine that that would be very intimidating to be seen by the police as cooperating in any way with agencies that they have a strained relationship with, let's say. And I should say, from our interviews with the police officers that we've spoken with, and read in this what you will, the police officers we've spoken with have been very, very favorable in their attitudes towards the special investigations unit. They see its necessity, they understand its role, they recognize the citizens' right to communicate the objectives of policing to the police service. What I would probably urge a note of caution on there is that we are probably talking to a very specific group of police officers. And there may be other police officers who speak to other groups and wind up in the media and maybe have different attitudes about these things, who are maybe less enthusiastic about the SIU. One of the big complaints that I always get about the SIU is they take time. There's other complaints that come along as well. So one of the things that we really want to attend to there is, what is it about this invitation that this individual who is marginalized in the community, marginalized in society, who is arguably is experiencing disadvantage and these types of exclusionary forces, is saying, yeah, I'm going to step up. I'm going to provide my data for you. And in a way, we can impute 2 types of things from that without asking a question to the service user directly. We could say, okay, there's a lot of them. They're disproportionately represented because they are so disproportionate in the population. We don't know, because we don't know what the full population is, but we can say, okay, there's so many of them that it must be indicative of a larger service group that's being affected is in the representation of these data. Or it can mean that those service users have trust in the organization. And they're saying, I trust this organization with my personal information. I think they're going to do good things with it. I think it's going to be useful. I think it can lead to good outcomes. Without speaking to them, I don't know which conclusion to draw. And it's really important for me to understand the motive to participate in the first place. Because participation is not without risks. It's something that does involve opening yourself up. And so that's really, I think, one of the things that we need to focus on more, is talking to people who take these surveys and say, how'd you end up here? What did you hope would be achieved when you handed your data, your information over to this organization through this provincial bureaucrat, this street level bureaucrat, and fed it into the machine and had all of your identifying factors stripped out of it, but still things that could be used to identify you left in. And what were you hoping for in that? That's a really important question for this research.
I think another thing to highlight to the degree of voluntariness is the fact that we naturally run into a selection bias, in the sense that not every person providing their data is, or not every person who encounters a public service organization is going to provide their data to said public service organization. And this is something that there are different ways around it, and one of the things that public service organizations should also further mandate is the idea of perceived race. So if there is a service provider, what did that service provider perceive in terms of the other person's racial identity? And that's very important, because the concept or the topic of perceived race can allow us to understand how one's racial background may or may not influence, or one's perceived racial background, apologies, could influence outcomes or the context of interactions. So in the context of policing, every time a police officer in this province fills out a use of force report post-2020, there's a section on the middle of the first page which specifies perceived subject race, and goes through the 7 categories as identified through the Anti-Racism Act. And the perception of race is really important, because it allows us then further to engage in more statistical analysis to understand how an officer's perception of one's race may have otherwise influenced their interaction or their decision-making processes in the context of that interaction with the member of the public. So the context or the concept of voluntariness is something that it presents unique methodological issues from a research standpoint, because of the fact we know that in these contexts, in these issues where voluntary race-based data is being provided, we know that we're not capturing all the data. We know that we aren't necessarily getting the most important or the most crucial data. For example, we don't know what percentage of those people actually participate in our study. We know that there are people who are involved in these investigations that will not participate. And that's really important, because of the fact that it's contributing towards us missing data. And this is why it's very important for the investigator or the service provider to document perceived race. And from there, we can also begin to compare how the investigator perceived one's race and how the individual or the service user identified their own race as well, and understanding how any disparities between the two may also influence outcomes as it relates to the interaction, or outcomes as it relates to the investigation or to the provision of services.
Thank you. Wow, perceived race, a whole other layer to this. Thank you for that. I think now we're at a point in our evening, and there's a couple of more questions I had, but to center the voice of our community, and perhaps a question from our community members here tonight, and we'll turn our attention there.
Just give me 1 second. I'm formulating. Can I ask, sorry, just because I missed the
This is Tammy Sadhu, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo. Patrick Watson. I'm an adjunct professor at Lakhdeep. We're both in legal studies, and Lakhdeep is the diversity lead. Is that right? At the library.
Is this on? Yes, okay, great. What is the strength of bringing research and community leaders, like everybody on this panel today, together to examine race-based data?
I gotta jump into this and say it's just a total pleasure to be in an esteemed panel of people that not only know this stuff, but live it as well, and care about it. And care about it to the point where they're here. It's a Wednesday night. It's the first awesome night of April in Canada. Not in Canada, at least in Ontario, I should say. Because my family out west is complaining about the rain coming that way. But look, the Jays are open tonight. This is the first night that this dome has been this open in Canada's history. It's been 34, 35 years since they built that dome. And most of Ontario tonight is tuned in. Hey, the Raptors are playing DeRozan tonight. Let's see if they can get into the playoffs. There's some heaviness going on around us tonight. But it's through that heaviness, it's through that also lives that these folks live, that I'm just esteemed to be on a panel with people that live this and breathe this every day. And it's a personal victory of mine to just be here tonight and take something away from tonight that can help me in my personal and professional life.
This is, the lifeblood of qualitative research is caring for people's lived experience, and it's qualitative research for somebody who's really had an interest in qualitative research since my undergrad days at Laurier, under the tutelage of Dr. Peter Eglin, one of the great qualitative sociologists in the world. It really is the lifeblood of my work, hearing from the lived experience of community members from the various different communities I've been researching over the years. I don't want to beat the drum too hard, but I do, that community engagement is the key to getting results. I was being interviewed this morning by CBC Radio Halifax, talking about the recommendations of the Mass Casualty Commission's report. And they sort of said, well, you're talking optimistically, you're talking pessimistically, you're talking neutrally. We get all three voices from you. What is your sort of vision for the recommendation of those reports? I said, it's only going to go so far as community members drive it. It really does, and it has been almost entirely, the weight of getting that commission's report put together has been almost entirely borne by the victims' families, which is just so much to bear. It is such a tragedy compounded on tragedy that those are the only people in our society, in our community, who are pushing for this thing that should have just been, it shouldn't be a question that when 22 people are shot dead by somebody masquerading as an RCMP officer, that we have to have a commission into it. There is no question, there is no a segment of doubt that can be had. We need to investigate that. That really it's getting into the community and just reaffirming with community members that we together, when we come together, we can affect great positive change. But it does take all of us to come together. We need to build our power together, to invigorate each other, to pick each other up. There's days where I do this work, and it can be taxing. But you remember, like this, I always have to keep in mind that the vast majority of our community members will experience far worse circumstances than I do by researching these materials. And that motivates us, and hearing those stories motivates us and keeps our feet to the fire and makes us remember that we're doing this because we believe in our communities and we want them to be strong, fruitful places for all of our brothers and sisters, so that we can all live productive, healthy, happy, satisfying lives.
lives. I think one of the most important things to highlight, this is something that's come out of my own research as well, is oftentimes when I go into the community and I meet community organizations or I meet leaders in the community, the immediate concern that many, especially in marginalized areas, whether they're socioeconomically marginalized, whether they're hyper-policed, or whatever the case may be, is people want to make sure this isn't the case of just like, are you going to be like the 50 other researchers who came into our neighborhood, take, and never put something back into the community. And I think one of the most fundamentally important things is the role of the researcher in the community. The researcher cannot solely sit in the ivory tower, the researcher cannot solely sit in the office, deliver lectures, deliver guest talks, and deliver conference presentations. The researcher has to be an integral part of the community and has to be involved to some degree or another in these community-based efforts. Because if the researcher is not contributing towards positive outcomes in the community, and the researcher is just, and pardon my take here, if the researcher is just using the research to get rich themselves or to make their career, it's going to contribute towards research fatigue. It's going to contribute towards people in the community not being trusting of researchers. And all of the work that's being done in this area, all the work that will be done in this area, it's all going to be undone if we do not have a research culture that is premised on community engagement and, in essence, allowing for that research to be used to improve the lives and settings or the scenarios that individuals find themselves in, which in many cases are far beyond the micro level and are affected by a range of systemic issues. So the role of the researcher is vitally important as it relates to addressing systemic racism, but the role of the researcher is vitally important because what the researcher does today is going to have an effect, an impact on somebody's decision to participate in future research 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now. And it's vital that the researcher in the community have these roles that are interrelated to one another.
Thank you so much for that, just for everything that's transmitted, right? It is carrying it right through that you are seen as an integral part of the community so that people can then feel comfortable sharing their stories with you. So I do have a question, eventually I'll get to it, I have comments too at the same time. So thank you for this evening, first of all, and understanding race-based data. I think the issue often comes because there are pros and cons to collecting race-based data, right? And I think a lot of times we're fighting what the cons are, and you are fighting that distrust that has been sown so deeply into systemic issues that people no longer feel comfortable in sharing what it is they're sharing. But I'm really happy to hear about the qualitative side of things and that people are getting to be able to tell their stories. However, I do feel that that presents another conundrum. And one of analysis is what I'm very interested in, is how are you going to analyze all of those stories in order to come forth with recommendations or outcomes that are going to make sense. So immediately my mind goes to solutioning, only because, so after you've collected the data, after we have analyzed the data, after we believe we have a picture of some sort that we can work with, what happens then, right? What are the solutions? So my background is in training and learning, and so I've heard so much about cultural sensitivity training that I don't want to hear it anymore because it creates awareness. We know this right off the front, but it doesn't create any behavior change. It does nothing about the heart condition. It does nothing to further what it is that we are trying to tackle. So I would stand up first and shout from the rafters that that's not the answer, right? So what is my question after your analysis? And then my second part of my question would be, and are you involving the community in the response? Because one thing that often happens as well, especially in Black and Indigenous communities, is after we have done the research, after we found out what it is that we want to find out, then we don't involve the community anymore in the solutioning piece, right? We're asking the communities what would work for you. We tend to use a lot of our mainstream techniques, etc., to impose them upon people instead of wondering what would work in that particular community. So there's questions in there somewhere.
So when it comes to solutions, I think one of the most fundamentally important things that, not to give myself more credit than I just heard, but one of the things that I approached my own dissertation research with was the idea that I'm going to assume that I know nothing of anything. And in particular, when I have these meetings with community organizations, when I have these meetings with leaders in the community, one of the things I ask is, what would you like to see? In an ideal world, if we could do anything that we want to do today, what would you like to see being done in that decision? Right? And so as it relates to my research, as it pertains to police tactical units or what everybody would call SWAT teams, there are many members of the public, especially those who have lived experiences, I've had the opportunity to interview, they basically said they don't need to act like SEAL Team 6. They don't need to have they don't need to have the equipment that they have. They don't need to have the escalated responses they have to issues that otherwise could have been addressed by patrol officers. Right? So using that feedback, using those comments, it's vital for me to incorporate that into the research. In addition to that, I care much more about presenting my work in the community than I do about presenting it at a conference. Because I can go to a conference and we can present this work, and sure, it's a line on our CV, it's something that looks good on paper, but what is the tangible outcome coming from this? Whereas if I go into the community, if I go to a rec center, if I go to a community organization and I present my research, first and foremost, the people at the heart of the research are going to understand that the researcher tried their absolute best, the researcher respected my lived experience, the researcher gave me an opportunity and a platform to share what happened with me and is trying to do something with it. Beyond that, however, those research findings presented in those contexts can spur future activist work. They can spur future work in the area. And the ultimate hope is that the work that we're doing is informed by members of the community to see what would you like to see being done. What to you is an ideal outcome in a situation or a set of scenarios like this. I hope I answered the question.
You know, that trauma-informed model, it puts the emphasis right on what we often in North America call the victim. You want the solution? Ask the victim. You want someone who give you the idea of what they need? Ask the person who felt that thing that burned them, whether it be systemic or whether it be out in the playground or whether it be in our society somewhere. Ask the victim. So I like that approach. Appreciate it. Oh.
It's such a great and challenging question. And, you know, I do have to sort of give me a culp on this, that I am not a particularly community-engaged researcher. I work with people who are community-engaged researchers. My research comes from court watching and document reading. You know, I read SIU reports day in, day out. I read court cases day in, day out. You know, one of the things that I've been focusing more and more on as sort of the outcome that I want from my research is less specific policy recommendations and more solidarity building. That what I view as being the value of my particular line of research isn't that I'm going to sort of uncover the next best policy for how to implement civilian police oversight, but rather that when I see something that's unjust, or that I perceive to be unjust, that I have a community of fellows that I can call upon and say, hey, A, do you see what I see here? Can you, you know, just put my perception into a broader perspective, and you know, is this something that we need to address? And then having that capacity through solidarity to address that issue that we perceive as being problematic. So I view this as being an exercise in trying to bring as many people into our, what's the right word for this, because networks is too corporatized, but it's networks of solidarity, into our communities so that we can see things with our own eyes, we can see the impact of those things with our own eyes, and we can collectively act to ensure that that we as a community direct the change that we know that we need, that we see that we need because we look at it. 2010, a UK-based researcher named Andrew Goldsmith wrote a paper that has some weight about policing's new visibility. Right? All these cell phones have cameras in. Every building has 1 million CCTV cameras on it. I think Andrew is based in London, where on average, if you ride the tube, you're caught on video camera 230 times a day, and that number is from 2008 or something like that when I lived over there. And so, you know, there's like, oh, every policing action is going to be caught on camera. And, oh, we're going to have all this great new capacity to change policing conduct. And 13 years later, we're like, it's not wrong, right? We have seen change, but have we seen the rate of change that we would expect given the, frankly, the atrocities we've seen? Like Tyree Nichols just being the most recent, you know, and the spectrum of atrocities that come between today and then. You know, like this is, how do we make sure that we have the capacity to pressure our political leaders to change these institutions? That's where I see the value of our approach, that we build these teams, we support new researchers who are coming up so that they can continue this work, that we signal to other researchers so that we can leverage our privileged social position to say, this is what our community, I don't hold the academic community as unique or distinct from the rest of my brothers and sisters in the world. You know that, you know, I'm a card-carrying faculty association member, the same way my UPS driver is a Teamster, and you know, I worked in QP when I was an RA or TA at the University of Guelph. That these are ways that we can build networks with each other, we can build communities with each other, and that together we can see our commonality and we can affect change that way. And when researchers view the world that way, I hope we can be more productive, that we are part of these communities. You know, I'd love to have an ivory tower. It sounds really nice. My tower is very short and it's probably made of clay. But you know, these are things that we have to be aware of, that what we're trying to do here requires the support of more than just academia. And frankly, you know, what the academics have to say on these things is very theoretical. So let's make sure that we are mobilizing our communities.
We'll have a last comment, but just before we get to that last comment, wow, thank you. Thank you for that. You know, communities need to be celebrated. If this work is community-driven, then we got to allow the community to celebrate wherever the community deems a milestone in the work, in the community, in the unfolding practice, I'll call it, of this thing called anti-racism. Because, you know, anti-racism, we must stamp it out wherever we find it, including in ourselves. There are racist things about all of us, tucked away in that side of our minds, in all of us. This work must be about the inner, looking at it, and then we can do something out in the community. Often this work is thrown, oh, the community will deal with it. This is a community-driven process, so we're good, check, we're cool. We got, like, you know, 5 beautiful black bodies on our committee tonight, so we're safe, right? But that work, to this point, of these humble people and doing this work, ain't about it. This work must be about first celebrating. Let's celebrate people that have, if you will, the gall to even survive. The gall to even survive in today's times, right? Inequitable times that are unfolding before us. I think there's a certain respect that is attributed to someone who has the audacity in today's world, whether it be the Indian who was supposed to be dead, that child was supposed to be killed, or whether that beautiful black body shouldn't have even made it here. Queensbush Settlement, just that you mentioned University of Guelph, so I think about Queensbush Settlement, and those beautiful black bodies made it all the way up here. We must celebrate. We must allow the community to celebrate. Thank you. I think we'll have our last comment, if we have a moment. I got it on there from that, didn't I?
I think just to add on to Lakhdeep's point, this research, in essence, rooted in resistance, right? The idea that we will not accept things the way they are, that there are things that can be changed, should be changed, and will be changed. This is not a matter of the situation of these issues being addressed in a year, in 2 years, in 5 years. Maybe they won't be fixed in my lifetime when I'm 29. But day in, day out, I can speak for myself, not as a researcher, not as a panelist here, but as a human being, one step in front of the next, day in, day out. This is the fight that I will wage for the rest of my life, the rest of my professional life, the rest of my personal life. And, you know, in essence, doing that work to look within myself and then using that same energy, using that same passion to influence or affect the world and the community in some positive way. Because if our research can help just one person, we're successful. Our goal is certainly to help more than just one person, but at the very least, if it's just one person, then we know we've made some positive, measurable difference in the world.
Thank you. I just wanted to end on that because that's beautiful. Thank you so much to our panelists today for sharing their expertise and their wise words with us. Our next Milton Public Lecture at the library here, in partnership with Laurier, will be a film. We'll be showing the film Safe Haven, which weaves together the stories of 2 generations of American war resistors who've sought safe haven in Canada during both the Vietnam and Iraq wars. And it will be followed by a discussion of the film with a professor whose research contributed to the film. So hopefully you'll join us for that on May 10th. And again, join me in thanking our panel today.